Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The bathroom on the third floor of Tianmu Junior High in Taipei had always felt wrong, even before anyone knew why. Students would rush through their business there, never lingering, never looking too closely at the mirrors that lined the pale green walls. Something about the lighting made faces appear hollow, shadows pool in places they shouldn't. But it wasn't until the autumn of 1993 that the whispers started in earnest, spreading through classrooms like fever, turning casual unease into genuine dread. A girl named Chen Mei-ling had been assigned late-night cleaning duty in that bathroom, a punishment for talking during assembly. And what happened to her in those empty hours would change everything. She had screamed so loudly that the night janitor heard it from 2 floors below, a sound so raw and terrified that he dropped his mop and ran, his footsteps echoing through the darkened hallways. When he found her, she was curled on the tile floor, shaking, staring at the mirror above the third sink with eyes that didn't seem to recognize the world anymore. Tianmu Junior High was one of those schools that looked modern enough from the outside, but carried decades of accumulated strangeness in its bones. Built in the late 1972s, it sat on land that older residents remembered as empty hillside, though some whispered it had been used during the Japanese occupation for purposes no one wanted to discuss in detail. The school itself was a 4-story concrete structure with long corridors painted in that institutional green that seemed designed to suppress any hint of joy. The third floor housed the 8th grade, classrooms, and the bathroom at the far end of the west wing had earned a reputation early on. Students said the water from the taps ran colder there than anywhere else in the building. They said the fluorescent lights flickered at odd intervals, creating brief moments of near darkness that made your heart skip. They said if you went in there alone, you felt watched, though the stalls were always empty when you checked. Chen Mei-ling knew all of this, of course. Everyone did. But knowing and experiencing are different things, and on that October evening when the sun had already set and most students had gone home, she stood at the bathroom entrance with her cleaning supplies and told herself it was just superstition. She was 14, practical-minded, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had raised her to dismiss ghost stories as foolishness. The bathroom was just a bathroom. The mirror was just glass and silver backing. The unease crawling up her spine was just her imagination, feeding on rumors. She set her bucket down, the sound of it hitting tile echoing strangely in the empty space, and began with the sinks, scrubbing at soap, scum, and water stains while humming quietly to fill the silence. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed their steady electric song, and for the first 20 minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly mundane, exactly as it should be. But then she noticed her reflection wasn't quite keeping pace with her movements. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as a trick of peripheral vision or the way the cleaning solution made the mirror surface temporarily unclear. She would reach for the faucet, and her reflection's hand would arrive at the chrome a fraction of a second later, as if the mirror were showing her actions on a slight delay. She stopped scrubbing and stood still, staring directly at her own face in the glass. Her reflection stared back, motionless, synchronized. She raised her right hand slowly. The reflection raised its right hand. She tilted her head. The reflection tilted its head. Everything matched perfectly. She laughed at herself, a nervous sound that bounced off the tiles and went back to cleaning, telling herself it had been nothing. just stress from the long school day and the creepy atmosphere getting to her. But as she moved to the next sink, she caught movement in the mirror from the corner of her eye. Her reflection was still standing at the first sink, watching her. She spun around to face the mirror directly, heart suddenly pounding, and saw herself standing exactly where she actually was, looking frightened, looking exactly as she should. The reflection at the first sink was gone, had never been there. She was letting the stories get to her, that was all. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to focus on the task at hand. She had 3 more sinks to clean, then the stalls. Then she could leave and never volunteer for late-night duty again. She moved methodically, keeping her eyes on her work, trying not to glance at the mirrors. But the feeling of being watched intensified with each passing minute, pressing against her back like physical weight. When she finally had to look up, she saw that her reflection was smiling. A wide, delighted smile that showed teeth, that crinkled the eyes, that spoke of genuine amusement. But Chen Meiling wasn't smiling. Her face was frozen in growing horror as she stared at the impossible image in the glass. The reflection's smile widened further, becoming something that didn't quite fit on a human face anymore, and that's when she screamed. The night janitor, Mr. Wu, found her on the floor, but getting her to speak took nearly half an hour. She kept pointing at the mirror, shaking her head, making small whimpering sounds that might have been words but came out broken. When she finally managed to form sentences, she told him about the delayed movements, about the reflection that stayed behind, about the smile that wasn't hers. Mr. Wu, who had worked at the school for 15 years and had his own collection of odd experiences in that building, didn't dismiss her story. He helped her to her feet, gathered her cleaning supplies, and walked her down to the principal's office where her parents were called. The principal, Mrs. Wang, listened to the story with visible skepticism, her lips pressed into a thin line that suggested she thought this was teenage dramatics, an attempt to get out of a deserved punishment. But over the next month, something shifted. 3 more students reported problems in that same bathroom. A girl named Lin Xiaofeng went in during lunch break and came running out, pale and gasping, saying her reflection had turned to look at her while she remained facing forward. A boy who had been dared by his friends to use the supposedly haunted bathroom reported that he saw someone standing behind him in the mirror, but when he turned around, the space behind him was empty. Then 2 girls fainted in the 3rd stall from the left. On separate occasions a week apart, both of them found unconscious on the floor with no visible injuries. No explanation beyond the terror still written on their faces when they woke. The school nurse documented each incident. The teachers began accompanying students to that bathroom, standing guard outside, though none of them would admit out loud that they were afraid of what might be happening inside. Parents started calling, demanding explanations, threatening to pull their children from the school. The story spread beyond Tianmu Junior High, picked up by local news, sensationalized into ghost tales that brought curious teenagers from other schools to peer through the fence, hoping to glimpse something supernatural. Mrs. Huang finally made the decision in November to have the mirrors removed from the 3rd-floor bathroom. It was framed as renovation, as an upgrade to newer fixtures, but everyone understood the real reason. The maintenance. Crew came on a Saturday when school was closed, and they worked quickly, unscrewing the large mirrors from the walls and carrying them out wrapped in protective cloth. They replaced the green tiles behind where the mirrors had been with fresh ones, creating a bathroom that looked somehow naked without reflective surfaces, strange in its incompleteness. The maintenance supervisor, a man named Chen, who was no relation to Mei Ling despite the shared surname, later told anyone who would listen that he had felt uncomfortable the entire time he worked in that bathroom. The air had been thick somehow, resistant, like moving through water. His assistant had complained of headaches that vanished the moment they left the room. And when they were packing up the old mirrors to take to storage, one of them had cracked down the middle for no reason anyone could determine, a perfectly straight fracture that split the glass as if something had struck it from behind, though nothing had touched it at all. The mirrors were eventually destroyed, broken down, and disposed of because no one wanted to be responsible for storing them. The bathroom was declared safe, reopened for normal use, and most students gradually forgot their fear. But Mr. Wu, the night janitor, developed a new routine. When he cleaned that bathroom during his late shift, which he had to do because it was part of his job, he would sometimes stop and listen. And in the deep silence of the empty school, with only the hum of distant lights and the creak of old buildings settling, he would hear it. A soft giggle, high-pitched and delighted, coming from the bare wall where the third mirror used to hang. It never lasted long, just a few seconds, just enough to raise the hair on his arms and remind him that removing the mirrors hadn't removed whatever had been looking through them. He learned to work quickly in that room, to keep his eyes on his mop and bucket, to never let his attention drift to that empty wall where the tiles were slightly newer than the ones around them. He learned that some problems couldn't be fixed by renovation or denial. He learned that sometimes removing the evidence of something didn't make the something itself go away. And on the quietest nights, when the moon was dark and the school felt especially empty, he could almost feel eyes watching him from that wall, studying him with an attention that felt hungry and patient, and far too interested in the living people who walked through that space. He never told anyone about the giggling, not after the first time when other staff members had looked at him like he was losing his mind. He just cleaned faster on those nights, finished his work, and locked the bathroom door behind him, knowing it wouldn't keep anything in or out, but doing it anyway, because the ritual of it made him feel slightly better. Chen Meiling never returned to that bathroom. She transferred to a different school the following year, her parents unwilling to let her stay at Tianmu after what had happened. But she carried the memory with her, the image of her own face smiling back at her with an expression she had never made, with an intention that was completely alien, completely other. She still had trouble with mirrors, sometimes, even years later, had to fight the urge to look away quickly, to check if her reflection was doing exactly what she was doing, to make sure the person looking back was really her. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as disturbing as that story is, it's far from the only time schools in Asia have been touched by unexplainable events. Sometimes the horror isn't in what you see, but in what appears on paper, in records that shouldn't exist, in names that have no owners. Just across the sea in Singapore, another school faced a different kind of haunting, one that couldn't be removed by taking down mirrors or renovating bathrooms, one that was woven into the very documents meant to track the living. What happened at Nanyang Primary School in 1987 proved that sometimes the most terrifying presences are the ones that insist they belong, that mark themselves present even when no one can see them sitting in the empty chairs. The attendance roster in Mrs. Tan's fourth-grade classroom at Nanyang Primary School had started showing names that shouldn't be there sometime in March of 1987, though it took her nearly 2 weeks to realize something was genuinely wrong. At first, she thought it was a clerical error, some administrative mix-up where students from another class had been accidentally added to her list. The school had just implemented a new computer system for tracking enrollment, and mistakes were expected during the transition from handwritten records to digital ones. But when she brought it to the office staff's attention, They checked their master files and found no record of the extra names at all. No student named Lim Wei Hong had ever been registered at Nanyang Primary. No one named Tan Siu Mei appeared in any class roster in the entire school. Yet there they were, on Mrs. Tan's printed attendance sheet, slipped in between legitimate students' names, marked present with neat check marks that Mrs. Tan didn't remember making. She started paying closer attention after that, watching her class list carefully each morning, counting heads, matching faces to names. Her official roster had 32 students. Some days she would count 32 children in the room. Other days, the numbers matched. But occasionally, she would hear whispers coming from the back corner near the windows, where several desks sat in a cluster, and when she looked, she would see exactly 32 students, yet the whispers continued. Soft conversations in children's voices discussing things she couldn't quite make out. She would walk to that corner, and the whispers would stop. The students in that area would look up at her with confused expressions, asking if something was wrong, insisting they hadn't been talking. The desks would all be occupied by students she recognized, students whose names were on her legitimate roster. But sometimes, just for a moment before she got there, she would see shadows in the seats, child-sized shapes that didn't quite match any of the students she knew. Nanyang Primary School had a long history in Singapore, one of the older Chinese medium schools that had transitioned to English instruction in the 1970s. The main building was a colonial-era structure with high ceilings and large windows designed to catch any hint of breeze in the tropical heat. But the school had expanded over the decades, adding new blocks to accommodate growing enrollment. Mrs. Tan's classroom was in the older section, in a wing that had been built in the 1952 on land that had previously been undeveloped. What most of the current teachers didn't know, because the school administration saw no reason to dwell on the past, was that during the Japanese occupation in World War II, the area had housed a temporary military hospital, not for soldiers but for civilians, particularly children who had been injured or displaced during the bombings and chaos of war. Many had died there, their small bodies buried in mass graves that were later moved when the land was cleared for school construction, or at least the graves were supposed to have been moved. Records from that period were incomplete, destroyed during the occupation, or lost in the administrative confusion of the post-war years. Mrs. Tan knew none of this history when she started noticing the extra names. She had been teaching at Nanyang Primary for 8 years, considered herself experienced and unflappable, the kind of teacher who could handle classroom disruptions and student dramatics without losing her composure. But this was different. This wasn't misbehavior or imagination. This was something that appeared in her official records, something that left physical evidence in the form of check marks and names that appeared in handwriting she didn't recognize, though it was close enough to her own to make her doubt her memory. Had she written those names? Was she going mad? She started keeping her attendance book locked in her desk drawer, checking it multiple times a day to see if new names appeared. Sometimes they did. Sometimes a roster she had checked just hours before would have an additional name squeezed into the margins, the ink looking fresh, the handwriting neat and careful. She began asking other teachers if they experienced anything similar, carefully phrasing her questions to avoid sounding unstable, mentioning odd clerical errors and computer glitches. Most dismissed her concerns, attributing everything to the new system's bugs. But one older teacher, Mr. Lim, who had worked at the school for nearly 30 years, gave her a strange look and asked which classroom she taught in. When she told him, he nodded slowly and said that Wing had always been a bit odd, that teachers who worked there sometimes reported unusual occurrences. though he didn't elaborate on what those occurrences might be. The situation escalated when Mrs. Tan decided to do a formal roll call one morning, reading each name aloud and waiting for the student to respond. She went through her official list of 32 names, each student calling out present or raising their hand in acknowledgement. Then, without consciously deciding to do it, she found herself reading additional names she didn't recognize but that were somehow present in her mind, clear as anything. She called out Lim Wei Hong, and from somewhere in the back of the room, she heard a soft voice respond present. She called Tan Siu Mei, and again, a quiet affirmation came from the area near the windows. She called 3 more names that had appeared on various attendance sheets over the past weeks, and each time she heard responses, young voices acknowledging their presence in her classroom. The other students had gone very quiet, their faces showing confusion and something else, something that looked like recognition or perhaps fear. After she finished, the normal classroom chatter didn't resume. The children sat in unusual silence, glancing at the back corner, at the windows, at spaces between desks where nothing visible stood. One girl, a usually outspoken student named Cheryl, raised her hand and asked in a small voice why Mrs. Tan had called names of students who weren't there. Mrs. Tan, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her attendance book, asked what Cheryl meant. The girl explained that she had heard the teacher call out names, but no one had answered. No voices had responded. Mrs. Tan insisted she had heard clear responses, 5 different voices acknowledging their presence. Several other students shook their heads. They had heard nothing except Mrs. Tan reading names they didn't recognize. But 2 students, both sitting near the back, near the windows, said they had heard the responses too. They had heard children's voices, soft and polite, coming from the empty spaces between desks, from seats that weren't occupied but somehow felt full. The class ended early that day. Mrs. Tan, badly shaken, dismissed the students for an extended recess and sat alone in the classroom, trying to make sense of what had happened. The silence felt different now, charged with presence, with the sense of being observed by many invisible eyes. She could almost hear breathing, soft and steady, the sound of children waiting patiently for instruction. She went to the principal, Mr. Wong, and told him everything. She expected dismissal, expected to be told she was overworked or stressed or perhaps needed time off. Instead, Mr. Wong listened with an expression that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd heard such a story. When she finished, he sighed and told her that he would make some inquiries into the school's history. He suggested she might want to document everything she experienced, dates and times and specific occurrences, in case they needed to bring in someone to investigate. He didn't specify what kind of someone, but his tone implied he wasn't thinking of building inspectors or computer technicians. Over the next week, Mrs. Tan kept meticulous records. She noted when extra names appeared on her roster and what names they were. She recorded the whispers she heard, and the times of day they seemed most frequent, which was usually late morning, around 10 or 11, when the sun was high and the classroom was warmest. She documented that other teachers passing by her room sometimes reported hearing children's laughter or conversation coming from inside, even during periods when her class was at physical education or in the library, and the room was supposed to be empty. Security guards doing their evening rounds mentioned seeing lights on in her classroom windows after everyone had left, seeing shadows moving inside that looked like children sitting at desks. Though when they went to investigate, the room was always dark and empty, the door still locked. Mr. Wong eventually shared what his research had uncovered. He had contacted some of the oldest living former staff members and searched through archived school records in the National Library. He confirmed that the area where the old wing stood had indeed been used as a wartime hospital for children, and that many young patients had died there from injuries and illness during the occupation. The bodies had been interred in a cemetery plot, but when construction on the school began in the late 1942, the remains were supposed to have been relocated to a proper memorial site. Whether that relocation had been completed thoroughly, or whether some graves had been missed in the rush to rebuild the nation after the war, was impossible to verify with certainty. The records were incomplete, contradictory in places, and many of the people involved in the construction had long since passed away. Armed with this historical context, Mrs. Tan began to see her classroom differently. The whispers weren't random sounds, but perhaps attempts at communication from children who had died in terrible circumstances, who had never received proper acknowledgement of their passing. The extra names on her roster weren't clerical errors, but the equivalent of phantom attendance, spirits marking themselves present in the only way they knew how, following the rituals of school even in death. It was heartbreaking when she thought of it that way. These invisible children still trying to participate in something they had been denied in life, still wanting to be counted, to be recognized, to belong. She started acknowledging them during roll call, reading the extra names when they appeared, and pausing to listen for responses, even though she knew most days she wouldn't hear them clearly. Some of her colleagues thought she had lost her grip on reality. Others, particularly the older staff members who had their own unexplained experiences, understood what she was doing. The students in her class adapted with the strange flexibility children sometimes show in the face of the supernatural. They grew accustomed to their teacher occasionally addressing empty spaces, to the whispers that came from nowhere, to the feeling of being in a room that held more people than they could see. Some children reported seeing other students they didn't recognize. Children wearing old-fashioned uniforms or clothes that looked like they came from decades past, sitting at desks or standing near the windows. Always quiet, always watching. These sightings were brief, lasting only seconds, but they were consistent enough that Mrs. Tan started to believe her students were genuinely perceiving something, not just feeding off her own experiences or playing make-believe. The school administration, uncomfortable with the situation but unsure how to address it, eventually decided to demolish the old wing. They framed it as necessary modernization, claiming the building was structurally unsound and needed to be replaced with facilities that met current safety codes. The demolition happened during summer break in 1988, and a new 3-story block with air-conditioned classrooms and modern amenities was constructed in its place. Mrs. Tan was assigned to a classroom in the new building when school resumed, and the extra names stopped appearing on her attendance roster. The whispers ceased. The strange sense of overcrowding in her classroom vanished. Everything returned to normal, or what passed for normal in the aftermath of such experiences. But the security guards at Nanyang Primary still report anomalies, even decades later. Even though the old wing is gone, and has been gone for years, they hear children's voices during their night patrols, faint and distant, but unmistakably young, coming from the area where the old building used to stand. They see movements in their peripheral vision, small figures that vanish when looked at directly. During roll call in the new building, particularly in classrooms positioned roughly where Mrs. Tan's old room had been, teachers occasionally report hearing extra voices responding to names, soft acknowledgments from students who aren't visible, who aren't on any official roster, but who seem determined to mark themselves present anyway. The school doesn't talk about it publicly, has no official policy for dealing with such reports, but there's an understanding among long-term staff that some presences remain. The children who died during the occupation, who were buried and perhaps not properly relocated, who suffered and died and were forgotten in the rush of history and rebuilding, they haven't left. They still attend school in their own way, still try to participate in the rituals of learning and childhood that were interrupted by war and death. And so teachers continue to hear phantom voices during attendance, continue to feel watched by invisible students, continue to wonder if the extra names that sometimes appear in the margins of their rosters are mistakes or messages, errors or evidence that the dead sometimes refuse to be absent, that they mark themselves present no matter how much time passes, no matter how many buildings are demolished and rebuilt, insisting quietly but persistently that they too belong, that they too deserve to be counted among the living, if only on paper, if only as voices that respond when their names are called. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. These two accounts reveal how schools, places built for children and learning, can become stages for the inexplicable, for encounters that blur the line between memory and presence, between the past and the living moment. But the stories don't end here. As we move deeper into this collection, we'll encounter horrors that take root not in institutions, but in the private spaces people consider safe, in homes and personal belongings that turn against their owners in ways no one could anticipate. The next two tales will show us that sometimes what we bring into our lives, what we welcome across our thresholds, carries with it consequences that can't be predicted or controlled, and once invited in, may never truly leave. The renovation crew at Akita High School in northern Japan didn't expect to find anything unusual when they began updating the third-floor lockers in the spring of 2001. The school had scheduled a comprehensive modernization of its oldest wing, replacing fixtures that had served students since the building's construction in the early 1962s. But when workers reached locker number 17 in the hallway outside what had been classroom 3B, they encountered something that made them stop and call for the principal before proceeding. The locker was sealed with layers of aged packing tape, yellowed and brittle with time, wrapped around the door's edges, as if someone had been desperate to keep it closed. More disturbing were the stains, dark rust-colored marks that had seeped through the metal's green paint, creating patterns that looked disturbingly organic, almost like handprints or the impression of fingers clawing from inside. The head of the renovation team, a man named Sato, who had worked on dozens of school projects throughout his career, admitted later that he felt genuine reluctance to open that locker, a primal unease that had nothing to do with professional concern, and everything to do with the way the stains seemed to have spread from the inside out, as if whatever had marked the metal had been trapped within, and had spent years trying to get out. Akita High School sat in a quiet residential neighborhood, a modest 3-story building that served approximately 600 students from the surrounding area. It had the utilitarian architecture common to Japanese schools of its era, concrete and functionality prioritized over aesthetics, with long hallways lined with lockers and classrooms that looked nearly identical. The school had a generally unremarkable history, no major scandals or tragedies that anyone remembered, though staff turnover had been notably high in the third-floor wing over the years. Teachers assigned to classroom 3B rarely stayed more than a term, requesting transfers to other rooms or different grades, citing reasons that were usually vague, mentions of uncomfortable atmospheres or difficulty concentrating. Students who had lockers in that hallway sometimes complained about their locks jamming or their belongings, going missing only to reappear days later in strange conditions, soaked through as if submerged in water despite no evidence of leaks, or smelling strongly of rust and old metal. Locker 17 had been out of use for as long as anyone could remember, sealed up at some point in the past, for reasons that weren't documented in any records the principal could find. Mr. Tanaka, who had served as principal for 8 years, searched through old maintenance logs and administrative files, but found no explanation for why that particular locker had been taped shut. When he asked older teachers about it, most had no recollection of the locker ever being functional. One elderly teacher, who was months from retirement, mentioned vaguely that there had been some incident in the 1970 seconds, something involving a student and that specific locker, but she couldn't or wouldn't provide details, her face closing down whenever he pressed for more information. The renovation couldn't proceed with one locker, sealed and unusable, so Mr. Tanaka authorized the crew to open it, to document whatever they found inside, and to replace it along with the others. Sato and his assistant used utility knives to cut through the layers of tape, the old adhesive releasing with sounds like tearing skin. As they worked, both men reported feeling increasingly cold despite the warm spring weather, their breath visible in small puffs, even though the hallway temperature registered normal on the thermometer they had mounted nearby. When the last piece of tape was removed and Sato pulled open the metal door, the smell that emerged was overwhelming, a combination of rust and something organic and deeply wrong, like meat left too long in a sealed container. Inside hung a school uniform, a girl's sailor-style outfit in the colors Akita High had used decades ago, before the design was updated in the 1980 seconds. The fabric was stiff and discolored, marked with the same rust-colored stains that covered the inside of the mart, lockers' walls. The discovery of the uniform prompted an investigation that uncovered a case the school had apparently tried very hard to forget. In 1973, a second-year student named Nakamura Yuki had vanished from school grounds during what should have been a normal school day. She had been present during morning attendance in classroom 3B, but when the lunch period ended and students returned to their afternoon classes, Yuki's seat was empty. Her classmates assumed she had gone to the nurse's office or been called to the principal's office for some reason. When she didn't return by the end of the day, teachers began asking around, checking with other students, with the nurse, with office staff. No one had seen her leave. Her outdoor shoes were still in the shoe locker at the school entrance, meaning she should still be somewhere in the building. But a thorough search found nothing. Her locker, in the third-floor hallway, locker 17, was found closed and locked. Her indoor, shoes and some textbooks inside, but no sign of the girl herself. Her parents were contacted, police were called. The school was searched multiple times over the following days and weeks. Yuki's disappearance remained a mystery. There were no witnesses to her leaving, no evidence of foul play, no reason anyone could determine for why a quiet, studious girl would suddenly vanish. The investigation eventually went cold, the case remaining open but inactive, another file of unexplained disappearance in a country that had more of them than most people realized. What Mr. Tanaka discovered in the archive records was that after Yuki's disappearance, students had reported strange occurrences around her locker. They heard humming coming from inside it, a girl's voice singing softly in a melody no one recognized. The locker would sometimes be found open in the morning, even though it had been locked the night before, Yuki's belongings arranged differently than they had been. One student claimed to have seen Yuki's reflection in the locker's small mirror, there for just a moment before vanishing. Teachers, uncomfortable with these reports and the way they were affecting students' mental states, had eventually decided to seal the locker, to remove it from use, and try to let the incident fade from collective memory. The uniform found in 2001 was Yuki's, confirmed by her family when they were contacted, though How it had gotten into the sealed locker was impossible to explain since it had been locked and empty after her disappearance. After the locker was opened, incidents began occurring with increased frequency. Students walking past Locker 17 reported feeling suddenly cold, feeling watched, feeling as if someone was standing very close behind them even when the hallway was empty. Several students claimed to see moisture seeping from under the locker door, a dark liquid that looked disturbingly like diluted blood, though when janitors checked, they found nothing. The floor dry and clean. The phenomena seemed to intensify during exam periods, particularly in the weeks leading up to final examinations. During these times, students and teachers reported hearing humming in the third-floor hallway, always the same melody, soft and almost soothing but deeply unsettling in its persistence and lack of visible source. One girl, a student named Kimiko, was found crying outside classroom 3B, insisting she had heard someone calling her name from inside the sealed locker, a voice that sounded young and scared, begging to be let out. Security guards doing their nightly rounds began avoiding the third floor when possible, particularly after the school installed security cameras throughout the building. The footage from the camera positioned to monitor the third-floor hallway showed something that made even skeptical staff members uncomfortable. On multiple occasions, the camera captured a shadow standing in front of Locker 17, a human-shaped darkness that appeared long after the school had been locked and emptied for the night. The shadow would stand motionless for minutes at a time, then vanish between one frame and the next, not walking away but simply ceasing to exist. Temperature sensors in the hallway registered sudden drops of up to 10 degrees Celsius during these appearances. The cold concentrated around the locker and dissipating within minutes of the shadow's disappearance. The school administration, faced with increasingly nervous students and staff, brought in a Shinto priest to perform a purification ritual. The priest, an elderly man who had served the local shrine for 40 years, agreed to bless the locker and the surrounding area. He arrived on a Saturday when the school was empty, accompanied by 2 assistants who helped him prepare the ritual space. But when he approached Locker 17 and began his prayers, he stopped abruptly, his face going pale. He told Mr. Tanaka that something was very wrong, that the presence he felt wasn't simply a restless spirit, but something confused and frightened, something that didn't understand it was no longer alive, something trapped in a moment of fear and unable to move forward. The priest completed his ritual, but he told the principal honestly that he didn't think it would be entirely effective, that whatever haunted that space was too strongly anchored to be easily released. The locker was eventually removed during the renovation, cut out of the wall and taken to be destroyed, but the space where it had been remained problematic. The new locker installed in its place malfunctioned constantly, its door refusing to close properly or jamming shut so firmly it required tools to open. Students assigned to that locker requested changes after only a few days, reporting nightmares, feeling sick whenever they approached their locker, sensing something watching them from the narrow metal space. One student opened his locker to find his textbooks soaked through with a dark liquid that stained the pages and smelled of rust and old metal, though investigation showed no source for any leak, and other lockers in the row were perfectly dry. The humming continued, particularly during exam weeks, soft and persistent, echoing through the third floor in a way that made students hurry through the hallway, made teachers schedule their classes to avoid having to be in that area during certain hours. The security cameras still occasionally captured the shadow, though less frequently than before, standing where the old locker used to be, motionless and patient, as if waiting for something or someone that would never arrive. The most disturbing incident occurred 3 years after the renovation, when a student staying late to study for entrance examinations reported seeing a girl in an old-fashioned uniform standing in front of the new locker. The student, a third-year girl named Ayumi, described the figure as translucent, visible, but not quite, solid, staring at the locker with an expression of deep confusion. When Ayumi asked if she needed help, the figure turned to look at her, and Ayumi saw that the girl's face was wet, not with tears, but with something darker, something that dripped from her hair and stained her uniform collar. The figure opened her mouth as if to speak, but instead of words, Ayumi heard only that familiar humming, the same melody that had been reported for years, and then the figure simply faded, becoming progressively more transparent until she was gone completely, leaving only damp footprints on the floor that vanished within seconds. Ayumi refused to return to school for a week after that encounter, and when she did come back, she requested a transfer to a different floor for her remaining months before graduation. The school administration quietly began discouraging students from staying late in the third-floor wing, scheduling late study sessions in other buildings, assigning clubs and activities to different areas. They never officially acknowledged the haunting, never put in writing what everyone knew, but the third floor became understood as a space to move through quickly, not to linger in, especially alone, especially during exam periods when the humming was most likely to echo through the empty hallways. The truth about what happened to Nakamura Yuki in 1973 was never officially determined, but theories circulated among students and some staff members who had researched the case. The most persistent theory suggested that Yuki had hidden in her locker during lunch period, perhaps escaping bullying or seeking privacy for reasons only she knew, and that somehow the lock had jammed, trapping her inside the narrow metal space. The old-style lockers were not designed to be opened from the inside, and if she had panicked, pulled the door too firmly shut, the mechanism might have locked in a way that made escape impossible. If she had called for help during lunch when the hallways were empty, when students were outside or in other buildings, no one would have heard her. By the time classes resumed, she might have been too weak to make noise, might have lost consciousness from the lack of air and the growing panic. The theory suggested she had died in that locker, her body somehow never found during the searches, perhaps because no one thought to check whether the locked locker might contain more than just textbooks and shoes, perhaps because the idea of a student being trapped and dying in such a mundane piece of school furniture was too horrible to seriously consider. The stains found in the locker in 2001, the uniform left behind, supported this theory, though it raised as many questions as it answered. If she had died in the locker, what had happened to her body? Why was only the uniform found 28 years later? The mysteries remained unsolved, but what was clear was that something of Yuki remained, something confused and frightened, still trapped in the moment of her death, still trying to call for help, still humming the melody she had used to comfort herself in the dark, still waiting for someone to open the door and let her out. The school learned to coexist with this presence, this echo of a girl who had vanished and never truly left, whose fear and confusion had imprinted so strongly on the space that even renovations and purification rituals couldn't completely erase it. And so the humming continues, soft and sad, particularly during exam weeks when stress runs high and the boundary between the living and the dead seems thinner, reminding everyone who hears it that some disappearances are never solved, that some deaths leave marks that time cannot erase, and that sometimes the missing are not gone but simply trapped, waiting in the spaces we pass by every day without truly seeing. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The lingering presence at Akita High showed how individual tragedy can bind itself to physical space, how one person's fear and confusion can echo through decades. But sometimes horror spreads differently, not confined to a single lost soul, but erupting in waves of mass hysteria, affecting dozens at once, in ways that suggest the supernatural doesn't always manifest quietly. What happened at a Malaysian school in 2008 demonstrated that terror can be contagious, that sometimes an entire community can be gripped by visions and experiences that defy rational explanation, and that the response to such phenomena reveals as much about human nature as it does about whatever unseen forces might be at work. The mass hysteria at SMK Sungai Petani began on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning in March 2008, during what should have been a routine science class in classroom 4 amperes on the school's second floor. The first girl to react was a 16-year-old student named Siti Amina, who suddenly stood up from her desk in the middle of a lecture on chemical reactions, her chair clattering backward, as she pointed at the ceiling with a shaking hand. Her face had gone completely white, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound, her eyes fixed on something near the ceiling fan that rotated slowly in the humid air. When she finally managed to speak, her voice came out as a strangled whisper that nonetheless carried through the suddenly silent classroom. 4 words that would be repeated hundreds of times in the coming days. "No face," she said. "No face." Then she began to scream, a high-pitched sound of pure terror that brought teachers running from adjacent classrooms, that sent her classmates backing away from their desks in confusion and growing fear. Siti collapsed before anyone could reach her, crumpling to the floor in a faint that the school nurse later said showed all the signs of extreme shock, her pulse racing, her skin cold and clammy despite the tropical heat. When she regained consciousness in the nurse's office 10 minutes later, she couldn't stop crying, couldn't stop whispering about the woman with no face who had been hovering near the ceiling fan, watching the class with attention that came from where eyes should have been but weren't. SMK Sungai Petani was a typical Malaysian secondary school, a sprawling complex of buildings that housed nearly 1,500 students in the small town of Sungai Petani in Kedah State. The school occupied land that had been agricultural fields for generations before being developed for educational use in the 1970 seconds. Classroom 4 amperes was unremarkable in every way. A rectangular space with windows facing the sports field, walls painted the standard institutional cream, equipped with the usual desks, blackboard, and a single ceiling fan that provided minimal relief from the constant heat. Nothing in. The room's history suggested it should become the epicenter of one of Malaysia's most widely reported cases of mass hysteria. But over the next 3 days, 37 female students in that classroom and adjoining rooms reported seeing the same thing Siti had described, a woman's figure floating near the ceiling or standing in corners, wearing what looked like a long white dress or gown, her body present but her face completely absent, a blank surface where features should have been. The descriptions were remarkably consistent, which authorities later pointed to as evidence of suggestion and collective delusion, but those who witnessed the hysteria firsthand noted that many of the affected students had not heard the descriptions before experiencing their own encounters, that they provided details before being told what others had seen. The school principal, Ensik Rahman, a practical man who had run the school for 12 years without encountering anything he couldn't explain, through logic and administrative procedure, found himself facing a situation that defied his usual approaches. Students were fainting in clusters, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single period. Girls would suddenly begin screaming or weeping uncontrollably, pointing at empty corners or backing away from spaces that appeared empty to everyone else. Some students reported feeling cold hands touching their shoulders or necks, feeling breath on their skin despite being alone. Others said they heard whispering in voices that didn't sound human, words in a language they couldn't understand, but that filled them with overwhelming dread. The hysteria spread beyond classroom 4 amperes to other parts of the school, seemingly following certain students or concentrating in specific areas, particularly the second-floor corridor outside the affected classroom and the girls' bathroom at the far end of the building. By the third day, the school administration recognized they were facing something beyond standard disciplinary measures or medical intervention. Parents were keeping their daughters home. The ones who did attend classes were too frightened to concentrate, and teachers reported feeling increasingly uneasy in certain areas of the school. Ensik Rahman made the decision to call in religious authorities, a choice that some criticized as legitimizing superstition, but that reflected the cultural reality of a predominantly Muslim community, where supernatural explanations held weight alongside scientific ones. A team of ustaz, religious teachers trained in Islamic spiritual practices, arrived to perform a cleansing ceremony. They recited Quranic verses throughout the affected areas, sprinkled blessed water, and conducted prayers meant to drive out malevolent spirits or jinn that might have taken up residence in the school. The students and staff were gathered in the assembly hall while this work was done, and many reported feeling a sense of relief as the prayers echoed through the building, a loosening of the tension that had gripped the school. But when classes resumed after the cleansing, incidents continued. A girl named Nurul reported seeing the faceless woman standing directly behind her teacher during a mathematics lesson, visible in the reflection of the classroom window. Another student, Farah, fainted during a history exam, later describing the sensation of being watched by something that stood right beside her desk, so close she could feel the displacement of air when it moved, though she saw nothing when she tried to look directly at it. Teachers began reporting their own experiences, reluctantly admitting they felt presences they couldn't explain, seeing movements in their peripheral vision, hearing sounds that had no source. One teacher, Puan Aziza, refused to return to classroom 4 amperes after she felt someone grab her arm while she was writing on the blackboard, looking down to see finger-shaped marks appearing on her skin, even though no one was near her, the marks fading within minutes but leaving her badly shaken. The situation reached a crisis point when 12 girls fainted simultaneously during an assembly, all of them pointing toward the second-floor windows and screaming about the faceless woman before collapsing. Ambulances were called, though medical examination revealed nothing physically wrong with any of the students, beyond elevated heart rates and signs of extreme anxiety. The school administration made the unprecedented decision to close classroom 4 amperes permanently, sealing the door and declaring the room out of bounds for students and staff. They justified this publicly as a temporary measure while they investigated possible environmental causes for the hysteria, mentions of gas leaks or mold exposure that might cause hallucinations, though private conversations acknowledged they had found no such problems and were simply responding to a situation they couldn't control through normal means. The sealed room became a focal point of fear and fascination. Students would dare each other to look through the small glass panel in the door, though those who did often reported feeling dizzy or nauseous, seeing movement inside the supposedly empty room, or experiencing the sensation of being watched by something on the other side of the glass. Security guards assigned to patrol the building at night reported hearing sounds from the sealed classroom, furniture being moved, footsteps on the tile floor, and once, a sound like someone laughing, high and feminine, and completely devoid of warmth. None of the guards would enter the room to investigate, and those assigned to patrol that hallway often found reasons to adjust their routes to avoid passing by the sealed door. The mass hysteria gradually subsided over the following weeks, though isolated incidents continued. Students occasionally reported sightings of the faceless woman in other parts of the school, always brief, always leaving the witness shaken and reluctant to return to whatever area they had been in. The bathroom at the end of the second-floor corridor developed a reputation for being haunted, with students refusing to use it alone, claiming they felt watched through the stall doors and heard whispers coming from the mirrors. Some students transferred to other schools, their parents unwilling to leave them in an environment where something unexplained had caused such widespread fear. Others stayed, but remained perpetually on edge, jumping at shadows, refusing to participate in activities that required being alone or in certain areas of the building. Teachers, who had been present during the worst of the hysteria, later described it as one of the most disturbing experiences of their careers, not because of what they saw, which was often nothing concrete, but because of the genuine terror in the students' faces, the visceral reactions that couldn't be faked or attributed to simple, attention-seeking behavior. Investigations into possible causes yielded no satisfying explanations. Environmental testing found no gas leaks, no toxic substances, no physical causes for the symptoms students reported. Psychological evaluations suggested mass hysteria brought on by stress, exam pressure, and the power of suggestion, particularly among adolescent girls who were more susceptible to this kind of collective delusion. But this explanation, while tidy and scientific, didn't account for the physical evidence some people reported: the marks on skin, the recordings of sounds from the sealed classroom, the footage from security cameras that occasionally captured anomalies, shadows where none should be, or brief figures that appeared and vanished between frames. Local historians researched the land the school was built on, discovering that the area had been used for agricultural purposes for generations, with no recorded tragedies or unusual events that might explain a haunting. Some speculated that construction work had disturbed something, that the building process had somehow created conditions that allowed negative entities to enter or manifest. Others believed the hysteria itself had created or strengthened whatever presence existed, that the collective fear and belief of so many people had given form to something that might not have had power before, a kind of feedback loop where fear created reality and reality reinforced fear. The sealed classroom remained closed for years after the initial incidents, the school working around it, using other spaces, pretending the room didn't exist. Eventually, as newer students who hadn't experienced the original hysteria filled the school, the fear began to fade from a constant presence to a legend, a story older students told younger ones, a dare to look through the window of the sealed room. But even as memory faded, the occasional incident kept the legend alive. A student would faint near the sealed door, or someone would report seeing a figure in white through the window, or a teacher would refuse to walk down that corridor alone at night. The room remained sealed, untouched, a physical acknowledgement that sometimes institutions must bow to forces they don't understand, must accept that not everything can be explained or controlled through policy and procedure. The most disturbing aspect of the entire incident, according to those who studied it, was the question of what the students had actually seen. If it was mass hysteria, a collective delusion, why were the descriptions so consistent? Why did students who hadn't heard others' accounts describe the same faceless woman in the same white dress, hovering in the same locations? If it was suggestion, how did it spread so quickly and affect so many people, including some teachers who were initially skeptical? And if something genuinely supernatural had manifested in that classroom, what was it and why had it appeared there? The faceless woman, if she existed beyond the collective imagination of traumatized teenagers, never communicated any purpose or message. She simply appeared, watched, and inspired overwhelming terror in those who perceived her. Some religious scholars suggested she might have been a jinn, a creature from Islamic theology that exists in a realm parallel to humans and occasionally interacts with our world. Others believed she might have been a Pontianak or similar entity from Malay folklore, spirits of women who died in childbirth or under tragic circumstances and who haunt the living. But none of these explanations fully satisfied, because the entity, if it was an entity, showed none of the behavior typically associated with these beings. It didn't attack, didn't communicate, didn't seem to want anything except to observe, to be present, to exist in a space that humans also occupied, creating terror through its mere appearance and its wrongness, the absence where a face should be serving as a kind of void that human minds couldn't process without breaking down. The sealed classroom at SMK Sungai Petani stands as a monument to the unexplained, a reminder that some questions have no good answers, that sometimes the most rational response to the irrational is simply to close the door, to seal off the space where normal rules don't seem to apply, and to move forward while acknowledging that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. And for those who experienced the hysteria firsthand, for the 37 girls who saw something that shouldn't exist, the memory remains vivid and disturbing, a moment when the comfortable reality they thought they understood cracked open to reveal something beneath, something that watched them from impossible angles with attention that came from nowhere, from a blank surface that should have held eyes but didn't, a presence that asked nothing and offered nothing except the gift of absolute terror, the knowledge that sometimes we share our spaces with things we cannot understand, cannot fight, cannot escape. Things that exist in the corners of rooms and the spaces near ceiling fans, waiting patient and faceless for reasons only they know, if they know anything at all. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The stories we've encountered so far have shown us institutions haunted by tragedy and loss, spaces marked by death and fear that refuse to let go of their ghosts. But the final two accounts move in a different direction, away from public spaces into the intimate and personal, into the kinds of horror that follow you home, that integrate themselves into your daily life until you can no longer tell where normal existence ends and nightmare begins. These last stories are quieter in some ways, less dramatic, but perhaps more disturbing because they show how the supernatural doesn't always announce itself with screams and mass fainting. Sometimes it seeps in slowly, patiently, disguising itself as coincidence or bad luck until you realize too late that you've been living alongside something terrible for far longer than you knew, and by the time you understand, it may already be too late to escape. The security guards at Baguio City National High School in the northern Philippines have learned to recognize the sound of footsteps that aren't quite right, shoes on tile that squeak with a particular rhythm, wet rubber soles moving through corridors that should be dry and empty in the deep hours of night. The sound appears most consistently during the rainy season, those months between June and October when the mountain city lives under perpetual gray skies and the smell of wet earth never quite leaves the air. But even on nights when no rain has fallen for days, when the hallways are bone dry and the windows show clear stars, the guards sometimes hear those footsteps making their slow, deliberate journey from the old science laboratory on the second floor toward the main exit. The sound is always accompanied by something else, a soft crying that seems to come from just around the next corner, just beyond the next doorway, the kind of weeping that sounds like it will never stop, like grief too profound to ever be comforted. When guards investigate, following the sounds through the darkened school, they find nothing except wet footprints on the floor, small prints from canvas shoes, leading in a straight line from the science lab to the front doors. The prints are always fresh, still glistening with moisture, but they never quite reach the exit, fading away in the vestibule, as if whoever made them simply dissolved into air before reaching the outside world, trapped in an eternal journey they can never complete. Baguio City National High School sits in the heart of Baguio, known throughout the Philippines as the summer capital, a mountain city built at an elevation that provides relief from the tropical heat that dominates most of the country. The school itself was established in the 1962, expanding over the decades to accommodate thousands of students from Baguio and surrounding areas. The campus sprawls across several buildings, some modern, some dating back to the school's earliest years, connected by covered walkways designed to provide shelter during the frequent rains. The old science laboratory building, a 2-story structure with large windows that were meant to provide natural light for experiments and demonstrations, had been in continuous use since the school's founding, though portions of it had been renovated multiple times. The building had a reputation among students as being slightly eerie, something about the way shadows gathered in the corners of the lab rooms, the way the old wooden floors creaked under weight, the persistent smell of chemicals and old wood that never quite dissipated no matter how much the rooms were aired out. But it wasn't until the tragedy of 1994 that the building became genuinely haunted, that stories about it shifted from vague unease to specific fear centered on a particular ghost with a particular story. The student's name was Maria Santos, 15 years old, a second-year student known for being studious and quiet, the kind of girl who kept her head down and focused on her schoolwork, who had ambitions of becoming a nurse and helping her family rise out of poverty. On an afternoon in August 1994, Maria had stayed late after classes to complete a science project in the laboratory, working on an assignment that was due the following week, but that she wanted to perfect. The weather that day had been typical for the season, overcast with intermittent rain showers, nothing that suggested danger. But weather in the mountains can change with terrifying speed, and what began as a moderate rainfall intensified within minutes into a torrential downpour, the kind that turns streets into rivers and makes visibility drop to almost nothing. Maria had gathered her things and left the science laboratory around 5 in the afternoon, according to the teacher who had supervised students working late and who locked up after Maria departed. She was wearing her school uniform and her white canvas shoes, the standard footwear most students preferred because they were cheap and practical, though they offered little protection against wet conditions. The route from the school to Maria's home required her to walk along several streets and cross a small drainage channel that normally carried minimal water, nothing more than a shallow stream that residents barely noticed. But on that particular afternoon, the drainage channel had become a raging torrent, swollen by the intense rainfall and runoff from the mountainside above. Witnesses later reported seeing Maria attempting to cross the channel using the small footbridge, a concrete structure that residents had used safely for years. The water level had risen to the point where it was flowing over the bridge, creating a swift current that made crossing dangerous. Maria apparently decided to risk it rather than wait for the rain to subside, perhaps worried about getting home before dark, perhaps not understanding how powerful the current had become. She made it halfway across before the waters swept her feet out from under her, pulling her into the rushing flow. She was carried downstream, her white shoes visible for just moments as she tried to grab onto rocks and vegetation along the channel's edge before the water pulled her under completely. Her body was recovered the following morning, caught against a culvert nearly a kilometer from where she had been swept away. Her school bag was found tangled in branches several hundred meters downstream, but her white canvas shoes were never recovered, despite extensive searches of the area, despite residents combing the drainage channel for weeks. Afterward, looking for any trace of them. The first reports of unusual activity in the science laboratory building came within weeks of Maria's death. A janitor working a night shift reported hearing footsteps in the second-floor hallway, the distinctive squeak of wet rubber shoes on tile, coming from the direction of the science lab. When he went to investigate, assuming a student had somehow remained in the building after hours, he found the hallway empty but noticed wet footprints leading from the science lab toward the stairs. He followed the prints, watching them extend down the staircase, across the first-floor hallway, toward the main exit. The prints stopped in the vestibule, simply ending mid-stride, as if whoever had made them had vanished. The janitor, a practical man named Roberto who had worked at the school for a decade, checked all the doors and found them locked from the inside. There was no way anyone could have left the building. He reported the incident to the head of security, who dismissed it as rainwater that had leaked in somehow, perhaps from a window left open. But Roberto knew the prints had been fresh, had seen the way water still pooled in the heel impressions, and he knew the building had been completely dry when he had started his shift. Over the following months, other night staff reported similar experiences: footsteps in empty hallways, wet prints appearing on floors that moments before had been dry, and always, threading through the sound of footsteps, the soft sound of someone crying, young and female, expressing a grief so profound it seemed to permeate the air itself. Students began avoiding the science laboratory building after dark, even those participating in evening activities or programs that required them to be on campus. They claimed the building felt wrong once the sun set, that the shadows were too thick, that the air felt heavy with sadness. Some students reported seeing a figure in the hallways, just a glimpse from the corner of their eye, a girl in uniform walking purposefully toward the exit, there for just a second before vanishing. Teachers who had known Maria recognized the description, the uniform, the white shoes that were always mentioned by those who caught sight of the figure. The phenomenon intensified during rainy seasons, particularly during heavy downpours that reminded everyone of the conditions that had killed Maria. On nights when rain hammered the roof and wind drove water against the windows, the sounds in the science laboratory building became almost constant. Guards, doing their rounds, reported hearing footsteps following them, always several meters behind, stopping when they stopped, resuming when they continued walking. The crying became louder during storms, sometimes rising to the level where it could be heard over the sound of rain, a keening sound of loss and confusion that made even skeptical staff members uncomfortable. One guard, a younger man named Carlos, who had started working at the school 3 years after Maria's death, and who had initially dismissed the ghost stories as superstition, encountered something that changed his perspective entirely. He was conducting a routine patrol during a particularly heavy rainstorm, checking that all windows and doors were secured against the weather. As he walked through the second-floor hallway of the science laboratory building, his flashlight illuminating the empty corridor ahead, he heard the footsteps behind him, closer than usual, almost at his heels. He turned quickly, swinging his flashlight around to catch whoever was following him, and for just a moment, he saw her. A girl in a soaked school uniform, water dripping from her hair and clothes, forming puddles on the floor around her feet. She was wearing white canvas shoes that were completely saturated, water squelching with each small movement she made. Her face was turned toward him, and Carlos could see tears mixing with the water that streamed down her cheeks, see her mouth open as if trying to speak, but producing only that soft, heartbroken crying. She reached one hand toward him, not threateningly, but almost pleadingly, as if asking for help or trying to convey something urgent. Carlos stood frozen, his flashlight beam cutting through her translucent form, his mind trying to process what he was seeing while his body screamed at him to run. Then she was gone, not fading gradually, but simply ceasing to exist between one heartbeat and the next, leaving only wet footprints and the lingering sound of crying that echoed through the hallway for several seconds before it too disappeared. Carlos reported the encounter immediately, calling the head of security from his position in the hallway, refusing to continue his patrol alone. When other guards arrived, they found him visibly shaken, found the wet footprints he described, followed them to the point where they disappeared in the vestibule. The incident was documented, added to the growing collection of reports that the school administration kept in a file they didn't publicize, but didn't dismiss either. The phenomenon was too consistent, too well witnessed by too many reliable staff members to be completely ignored. The school brought in a priest, Father Miguel, from a nearby parish, who agreed to bless the building and offer prayers for Maria's soul. The priest conducted his blessing on a Saturday afternoon, walking through every room in the science laboratory building, sprinkling holy water, reciting prayers for the dead. When he reached the second-floor hallway where Maria's ghost was most frequently encountered, he paused, his expression troubled. He told the school principal later that he had felt a profound sadness in that space, not evil or malevolent, but lost and confused, a presence that didn't seem to understand it was dead, that was still trying to complete the journey home that had been interrupted on that terrible afternoon in 1994. The blessing provided temporary relief. For several weeks after Father Miguel's visit, the reports of footsteps and crying diminished. The science laboratory building felt lighter, less oppressive, and staff began to hope that Maria's spirit had finally found peace. But as the rainy season progressed and the anniversary of Maria's death approached, the phenomena resumed. The footsteps returned. The crying echoed through empty hallways. The wet footprints appeared on dry floors. Whatever had been done hadn't been enough to release Maria from whatever held her in that building, whatever compelled her to repeat her final journey night after night. The school administration eventually accepted that Maria's presence was something they would have to accommodate rather than eliminate. They adjusted guard schedules so that no one had to patrol the science laboratory building alone at night. They instructed staff not to investigate the sounds of footsteps or crying, to simply note the occurrences in their logs and continue with their duties. Teachers learned to lock the science laboratories carefully at the end of each day, to avoid working late in that building, to schedule activities elsewhere when possible. Students absorbed the understanding that the science laboratory building was haunted, that Maria Santos still walked its halls, that her white shoes still squeaked on the tiles as she made her way toward an exit she would never reach, toward a home she would never arrive at. The story became part of the school's culture, passed from older students to younger ones, a legend that was simultaneously frightening and sad, a reminder of how quickly life could end, how a simple decision to risk crossing a flooded bridge could result in death and an eternity of confused wandering. Some students left flowers occasionally in the second-floor hallway, small tributes to a girl they had never known but whose presence they felt, whose sadness seemed to permeate the building. The classed school created a memorial scholarship in Maria's name, a small plaque in the hallway commemorating her death and offering financial assistance to students pursuing nursing studies, the career Maria had hoped to achieve. These gestures seemed to matter, seemed to create brief periods where the phenomena lessened, as if Maria appreciated being remembered, being acknowledged as more than just a ghost, as a person who had lived and dreamed and died too young. But the footsteps never stopped completely. Year after year, particularly during the rainy season, particularly during storms that echoed the conditions of that fatal afternoon. Guards continue to hear the squeak of wet shoes on tile, continue to find fresh footprints leading from the science laboratory toward the exit. The crying continues, soft and persistent. The sound of someone who cannot be comforted because they cannot understand what has happened to them, cannot process that the journey they are trying to complete ended decades ago, that the home they are walking toward no longer exists in the form they remember. Maria Santos remains trapped in the moment of her death, endlessly replaying her final attempt to reach safety, endlessly walking through the school she once attended, leaving behind only wet footprints and tears and the memory of white canvas shoes that were never recovered from the rushing water that claimed her life. The tragedy lies not just in her death, but in her inability to rest, in whatever confusion or attachment keeps her bound to that building, walking its corridors in an endless loop of grief and futility. Staff members who have worked at Baguio City National High for many years speak of Maria with a mixture of fear and pity, describing her not as a malevolent presence, but as a lost child who cannot find her way home, who is so focused on completing her journey that she doesn't realize the journey itself has become her prison. They have learned to coexist with her, to acknowledge her presence without letting it disrupt the daily functioning of the school, to accept that some spaces are shared with the dead, that history doesn't always release its grip on the present, that sometimes a life cut short continues in shadow form, repeating its final moments with mechanical precision, unable to move forward, unable to rest, unable to do anything except walk and cry and leave wet footprints that lead nowhere, that fade before reaching their destination, just as Maria herself faded from life before reaching hers. Caught forever between school and home, between life and death, between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond, trapped in that liminal space by circumstances no one fully understands, and no intervention seems able to resolve. The most disturbing aspect, according to those who have encountered Maria's presence most directly, is the sense of awareness she sometimes displays. Unlike other ghosts that seem to replay recorded actions without consciousness, Maria occasionally shows signs of recognizing the people who see her, of trying to communicate something beyond her endless grief. Guards who have seen her multiple times report that she looks at them with recognition, as if she knows they are not threats, as if she is trying to tell them something but lacks the ability to form words. On several occasions, witnesses have reported that she appears more agitated than usual, that the crying intensifies, that she moves faster as if urgency has suddenly possessed her. These episodes often coincide with severe weather, with flooding in other parts of the city, as if Maria somehow remains connected to the conditions that killed her, as if she experiences renewed panic when rain threatens others the way it threatened her. Some staff members believe she is trying to warn people, trying to prevent others from making the mistakes she made, from risking their lives in flooded conditions. This interpretation, whether accurate or simply a compassionate reading of incomprehensible phenomena, has led to a kind of relationship between the school community and Maria's ghost. She's no longer seen purely as a frightening presence, but as a tragic figure deserving of sympathy, a reminder to take weather seriously, to not risk crossing flooded areas, to value life and safety over convenience or haste. Students are told Maria's story not as a ghost tale meant to frighten, but as a cautionary account with real consequences, a reminder that the mountain's beautiful rains can turn deadly without warning, that respect for nature's power is not optional, but essential for survival in a city where water can transform from life-giving to life-taking in mere minutes. The white shoes have become central to Maria's legend, the detail that makes her story specific and memorable. Students speculate about why they were never found, creating theories that range from the practical to the supernatural. Some believe they were simply carried too far downstream, buried in mud or silt in places no one thought to search. Others think they were caught in the drainage system's underground portions, trapped in culverts or pipes, where they remain to this day, slowly deteriorating in the dark. More supernatural explanations suggest that the shoes themselves are cursed, that they carry Maria's spirit, that they are the anchor keeping her tied to the mortal world. According to this theory, if the shoes could be found and properly laid to rest with Maria's body, she would finally be freed to move on. But after 3 decades, the likelihood of ever finding those shoes is essentially zero. They have become mythical objects, white canvas shoes that exist primarily in story and in the wet footprints that appear in empty hallways. Evidence of something that can no longer be found in physical form, but that continues to leave its mark on the present. Every student who attends Baguio City National High learns about Maria and her. White shoes absorbs the story as part of the school's identity, carries it forward into their adult lives. The tale has spread beyond the school into the wider Baguio community, becoming one of the city's many ghost stories, part of the oral tradition that keeps history alive and personal, emotional terms rather than just dry dates and facts. The science laboratory building will likely never be free of Maria's presence. The school has considered demolishing the structure multiple times, replacing it with a modern facility, but each time the discussion arises, there is resistance. Some feel that tearing down the building would be disrespectful to Maria's memory, that it would destroy the last physical connection she has to the life she lost. Others worry that demolition might not free her spirit, but simply relocate it, that she might begin haunting whatever structure replaced the old building, or might shift her wandering to other parts of the campus. So the building remains, aging, gracefully, its hallways walked by living students during the day, and by one dead girl at night, its floors bearing the footsteps of the present and the ghostly impressions of the past. The crying continues, soft background music to the rainy seasons, a sound that has become so familiar to long-term staff that they barely register it anymore, like the way city dwellers stop hearing traffic, or rural residents stop noticing insect songs. But new guards, new teachers, new students still experience that jolt of fear and sadness when they first encounter Maria's presence, when they first hear those wet footsteps approaching from behind, when they first glimpse that translucent figure in a soaked uniform, trying desperately to reach a home that no longer exists except in memory and in the endless repetition of a ghost who cannot accept that her journey ended decades ago in rushing water and tragedy. She remains a fixture of Baguio City National High School, not its most famous feature, but perhaps its saddest. A reminder that some stories never end, that some lives are interrupted but not concluded, that death itself is not always the final chapter, but sometimes just the beginning of a different kind of existence, one measured in footsteps and tears, and the eternal attempt to complete one last journey home through hallways that never change, toward doors that never open, in white shoes that no one will ever find. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.